Sleep Deprivation Experiments. How many days can the human mind survive? Part 1. Sleep is something most people take for granted. Every night, without thinking much about it, we close our eyes and allow our minds to shut down. For a few hours, consciousness fades, the outside world disappears, and the brain enters a strange and mysterious state we still do not fully understand. But what if that process stopped? Sleep Deprivation Experiments. How many days can the human mind survive? Part 2. By the time Randy Gardner reached the 8th day without sleep, his body and mind were entering territory that very few humans had ever experienced. More than 200 hours had passed since he had last closed his eyes to rest. For the scientists observing the experiment, every new hour brought a mixture of fascination and concern. Gardner was still awake, but the person standing in that room was no longer the same teenager who had started the experiment days earlier. Sleep deprivation had begun to reshape the way his brain interacted with the world. His sense of time was no longer reliable. Minutes sometimes felt stretched into long periods of confusion. At other moments, entire conversations seemed to disappear from his memory as if they had never happened at all. Researchers continued performing cognitive tests to measure how his brain was functioning. One test required Gardner to subtract 7 repeatedly from a large number, a simple mental exercise designed to measure concentration and working memory. Earlier in the experiment, he had performed the task easily. Now he struggled. Sometimes he lost track of the numbers entirely and stared at the researchers in silence, trying to remember what he had been asked to do. His mind was beginning to stall. But perhaps the most disturbing changes were happening inside his perception of reality. Gardner reported seeing shapes moving in the corners of the room that no one else could see. Shadows appeared to stretch across walls. Ordinary objects occasionally transformed into something else entirely. One evening he believed the floor was covered in insects. He stared down at the ground, carefully stepping over areas where he believed hundreds of tiny creatures were crawling across the surface. To the researchers watching him, the floor was completely empty. These hallucinations were not random. Sleep deprivation interferes with the brain's sensory processing systems. Normally the brain filters enormous amounts of information from the environment, separating meaningful signals from background noise. But when the brain becomes severely exhausted, those filters begin to fail. The result is a chaotic stream of sensory confusion. The brain begins filling the gaps itself, sometimes with shapes, sometimes with sounds, and sometimes with entire false realities. By the ninth day, Gardner's emotional state had become unpredictable. At one moment he seemed calm and cooperative. Minutes later he could become frustrated or suspicious without any obvious reason. This emotional instability is one of the most common symptoms of severe sleep deprivation. The brain regions responsible for emotional regulation, particularly the prefrontal cortex, begin losing their ability to control deeper emotional centers like the amygdala. In simple terms, the rational part of the brain starts losing control over the emotional part. The result is a mind that reacts more strongly to stress, fear, and confusion. At times, Gardner laughed at things that were not funny. At other moments, he seemed deeply concerned about problems that did not exist. Yet somehow, he continued to push forward. The experiment had now lasted longer than anyone originally expected. Scientists monitoring Gardner were beginning to understand something remarkable. The human body can endure an incredible amount of stress, but the human mind has limits, and those limits were getting closer. Around this time, Gardner also began experiencing severe problems with coordination. When asked to touch his finger to his nose with his eyes closed, a simple neurological test, he missed repeatedly. Walking in a straight line became difficult. His body moved slowly, almost as if he were underwater. But what worried researchers most was the increasing frequency of microsleep episodes. Earlier in the experiment, these brief shutdowns of the brain had lasted only a second or two. Now they were becoming longer. Several times Gardner seemed to pause in the middle of a sentence, his eyes open but unfocused, completely silent for several seconds before suddenly resuming the conversation. It was as if his brain had temporarily disconnected. These microsleeps are the brain's last line of defense. When exhaustion reaches extreme levels, the brain will force small fragments of sleep into consciousness whether the person wants it or not. In many dangerous situations, such as driving long distances at night, microsleeps can have fatal consequences. A driver may appear awake while actually experiencing brief moments of unconsciousness. Just a few seconds can be enough to cause a catastrophic accident. But inside the laboratory, Gardner remained under constant supervision, and the experiment continued. By the 10th day, the psychological strain had become undeniable. Gardner began having difficulty forming clear thoughts. When asked simple questions, he sometimes responded with answers that did not make sense. His attention wandered constantly. The researchers noticed that he frequently rubbed his eyes and stared blankly at the walls, as if trying to focus on something only he could see. At one point he believed a radio station in the distance was sending him secret messages. He listened carefully, convinced that hidden information was being broadcast specifically for him. Moments like this demonstrated just how powerful sleep deprivation can be. Without sleep, the brain begins to lose its ability to distinguish between internal thoughts and external reality. Ideas that would normally be dismissed as impossible suddenly feel completely believable. But the most surprising moment of the entire experiment arrived near the end. After more than 10 full days without sleep, Gardner had reached the point where his mind should have collapsed entirely. Instead, during one cognitive test, he managed to perform surprisingly well. Researchers asked him to play a simple pinball-style game designed to test reflexes and concentration. Despite his exhaustion, Gardner performed almost perfectly. Scientists were stunned. How could a brain under such extreme sleep deprivation suddenly function so well? The answer lies in one of the brain's most fascinating survival mechanisms. Under extreme stress, the brain can temporarily release bursts of adrenaline and other chemicals that sharpen focus and reaction time. These brief moments of clarity can mask the underlying damage caused by exhaustion, but they do not last long. Soon after, Gardner's performance dropped again. His speech slowed further. His thoughts became scattered. Finally, after 11 days and 24 minutes without sleep, the experiment reached its conclusion. Randy Gardner had remained awake for a total of 264 hours. It was the longest scientifically documented period of voluntary sleep deprivation ever recorded. The moment the experiment ended, Gardner was allowed to sleep. Researchers expected him to remain unconscious for an extremely long time, but the results were surprising. Gardner slept for about 14 hours during his first recovery sleep. When he woke up, he felt groggy but surprisingly stable. Over the next several days, he experienced longer than normal sleep cycles as his brain gradually returned to its normal rhythm. And most importantly, doctors found no evidence of permanent brain damage. For many scientists, this result was astonishing. The human brain had endured more than 11 days without sleep and managed to recover. But the experiment also revealed something important. While Gardner recovered, the psychological effects he experienced during the experiment were severe. Hallucinations, paranoia, memory failure, emotional instability. These symptoms demonstrated how quickly the human mind can lose stability when deprived of sleep. But Randy Gardner's case was only one experiment, and scientists wanted to know something else. What happens when sleep deprivation continues even further? What happens when the brain is denied sleep not for days, but for weeks? In the decades that followed, researchers would attempt to answer that question through other experiments. Some of them would produce results far more disturbing than anything seen in Gardner's test. Because while the human brain can survive extreme exhaustion, there may be a point where recovery is no longer possible, and discovering that point would lead scientists into one of the darkest areas of sleep research. What would happen if a human being simply never slept again? At first glance, the idea may not seem particularly frightening. Most people have experienced a sleepless night before. Maybe you stayed awake studying for an exam, finishing a project, or traveling on a long flight. The next day you felt tired, maybe a little irritable, but eventually everything returned to normal. But the truth is far darker. Sleep is not simply rest. It is not just a break from consciousness. Sleep is a biological necessity built into the deepest layers of the human brain. Without it, the mind begins to unravel. Scientists have been fascinated by this question for decades. What happens when the brain is denied sleep for extended periods of time? How long can a person remain awake before the mind begins to collapse? To answer this question, researchers conducted a series of strange and sometimes disturbing experiments. Some of these experiments would become legendary in the history of science, and one of them would push the limits of the human mind further than anyone thought possible. The year was 1964. In San Diego, California, a 17-year-old high school student named Randy Gardner volunteered for what seemed like a simple science experiment. The goal was straightforward: stay awake as long as possible. Gardner and two friends originally designed the experiment as a school science project, but when researchers learned about the attempt, professional scientists and sleep experts quickly became interested. They realized this unusual challenge could provide rare insight into the effects of extreme sleep deprivation. The rules were simple. Randy Gardner would remain awake under observation, while researchers monitored his physical and psychological condition. At first, nobody expected the experiment to last very long. Most people assumed exhaustion would force him to stop after 2 or 3 days. But what happened next surprised everyone. The first day passed easily. Gardner felt energetic and alert. He spent his time playing games, talking with friends, and moving around to stay awake. Researchers conducted simple tests to measure his mental performance, memory, and reaction time. The results were completely normal, but by the second day, subtle changes began to appear. Gardner started having trouble concentrating on complex tasks. When researchers asked him to perform simple mathematical calculations, he took longer than usual to answer. His brain was already beginning to slow down. This was the first signal that something deeper was happening. Sleep deprivation does not attack the body immediately. Instead, it begins by quietly disrupting the brain's ability to process information. By the third day, the changes became much more noticeable. Gardner's mood started fluctuating rapidly. At times he laughed uncontrollably, while at other moments he became irritated and impatient without any clear reason. His memory also began to suffer. Researchers noticed that he frequently forgot instructions only minutes after hearing them. When asked to repeat information that had just been explained, he sometimes struggled to recall basic details. The brain was losing its grip on short-term memory, but the most unsettling symptoms had not appeared yet. That moment arrived on the fourth night. Late in the evening, Gardner reported seeing something unusual in the room. He believed that a streetlight outside the building was moving toward him and watching him through the window. Of course, the light had not moved at all. Gardner was experiencing his first hallucination. Sleep deprivation had begun to distort his perception of reality. Researchers observing the experiment realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The brain, deprived of sleep for long enough, begins to create its own reality. The line between imagination and perception starts to blur. By the fifth day, Gardner's condition had become even stranger. At one point, he believed a road sign in the distance was actually a person standing and staring at him. Later that same day, he suddenly became convinced he was a famous football player. The delusion lasted several minutes before he realized something was wrong. But there was another phenomenon occurring inside his brain that researchers found even more fascinating. Gardner had begun experiencing what scientists call microsleep. Microsleep is one of the brain's emergency defense mechanisms. When the brain becomes severely exhausted, it begins forcing brief moments of sleep without the person's awareness. These episodes may last only a few seconds, but during that time the brain essentially shuts down. The person's eyes may still be open. They may even appear awake. But for those few seconds, consciousness disappears. In Gardner's case, these microsleep episodes began happening more frequently as the days passed. Researchers noticed that during conversations he sometimes paused suddenly, as if his mind had briefly disconnected. These moments were extremely short, sometimes lasting only a second or two. But they revealed something important. The brain was fighting back. No matter how determined a person might be to stay awake, the brain will eventually attempt to force sleep on its own. By the sixth day, Gardner's coordination had deteriorated significantly. His speech slowed down. His reflexes became sluggish. Simple physical tasks, such as catching a ball or walking in a straight line, became increasingly difficult. But perhaps the most alarming symptom was paranoia. Gardner began to suspect that some of the researchers observing him were secretly plotting against him. At one point he accused a scientist of being an undercover agent monitoring the experiment for hidden purposes. The researchers understood this was not unusual. Extreme sleep deprivation can cause the brain to misinterpret social signals and perceive threats that do not exist. By the seventh day, Gardner's cognitive abilities had declined even further. His ability to form coherent sentences was becoming inconsistent. Words sometimes came out in the wrong order. Occasionally, he struggled to find the correct word during conversations. The brain's language centers were beginning to malfunction. And yet, despite everything happening inside his mind, Gardner was still awake, still conscious, still pushing the limits of human endurance. By the 8th day, the experiment had reached a point that few people thought possible. Randy Gardner had remained awake for over 200 hours. Scientists monitoring the experiment were now deeply concerned. They had never observed a human brain operating under such extreme sleep deprivation before. The question everyone was asking was simple. How much longer could this continue? Because by now, Gardner was no longer just tired. His brain was operating in a completely altered state. His sense of time had become distorted. Minutes sometimes felt like hours. Conversations became difficult to follow. At times, he seemed disconnected from his surroundings. Yet surprisingly, certain abilities remained intact. When researchers asked him to perform some tasks requiring concentration, such as playing simple games or responding to certain challenges, he occasionally performed better than expected. This revealed another strange aspect of the human brain. Even when heavily exhausted, certain mental systems can temporarily compensate for the damage caused by sleep deprivation, but that compensation never lasts forever. Eventually, the brain begins to lose control, and as the experiment moved closer to its final stages, researchers were about to discover just how fragile the human mind could become, because what happens after 10 days without sleep is something the brain was never designed to handle, and the consequences can be far more disturbing than anyone expected. The story of Randy Gardner was only the beginning. What scientists would discover in the years that followed would reveal something even more unsettling. Sleep is not optional. It is not simply a habit. Sleep is one of the most fundamental survival mechanisms in the human brain, and when it is removed, the mind slowly begins to break. But Gardner's experiment had not yet reached its most extreme moment, because the true limit of human wakefulness was still approaching, and no one knew exactly what would happen when that limit was finally crossed. Sleep deprivation experiments. How many days can the human mind survive? Part 3. When Randy Gardner finally fell asleep after more than 11 days awake, the scientific community had learned something extraordinary. The human brain was far more resilient than many researchers expected, but the experiment also raised a much darker question. If a person could survive 11 days without sleep, what would happen if the brain were forced to stay awake even longer? For ethical reasons, scientists could not continue pushing human volunteers beyond that point. The psychological damage observed during Gardner's experiment had already shown how dangerous extreme sleep deprivation could become. So researchers turned to another method, animal studies, and what they discovered would reveal something deeply unsettling about the true importance of sleep. In the 1980s, researchers at the University of Chicago designed one of the most controversial sleep experiments ever conducted. The goal was simple: prevent laboratory rats from sleeping entirely and observe what happened. The scientists created a special rotating platform suspended above a shallow pool of water. 2 rats were placed on the platform. Whenever brain sensors detected that one of the rats was about to fall asleep, the platform began slowly rotating. If the rat did not wake up immediately, it would lose its balance and fall into the water. The animal quickly learned that sleeping meant falling, so it stayed awake. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The rats behaved normally for the first couple of days. They ate food, explored their surroundings, and continued moving around the platform. But after several days without sleep, strange changes began to appear. The rats started eating far more food than usual. Despite this, they began losing weight rapidly. Their bodies were burning energy at an extreme rate, as if their metabolism had suddenly accelerated beyond control. Then something even stranger happened. Their fur began to deteriorate. Small lesions appeared on their skin. Their body temperature started rising uncontrollably, and their immune systems began to collapse. Within 2 weeks, every rat subjected to total sleep deprivation died. The researchers repeated the experiment multiple times. The results were always the same. Without sleep, the body eventually shuts down. These findings shocked the scientific community. Sleep was not simply a mental function. It was something much deeper, something essential to life itself. But scientists still wanted to understand why. Why would the absence of sleep cause the body to fail so catastrophically? For years, this question remained one of the biggest mysteries in neuroscience. Then, in 2013, researchers made a discovery that changed our understanding of sleep forever. Inside the human brain, scientists discovered a previously unknown system called the glymphatic system. The system functions like a cleaning network for the brain. Throughout the day, the brain produces waste products as neurons communicate with each other. Tiny proteins and metabolic byproducts slowly accumulate between brain cells. If these waste materials are not removed, they begin to interfere with normal brain function. Over time, they can even contribute to serious neurological diseases. But during sleep, something remarkable happens. The brain literally begins washing itself. The glymphatic system activates and flushes cerebrospinal fluid through brain tissue, clearing away toxic proteins and metabolic waste. One of the most important substances removed during this process is a protein called beta amyloid. This protein is strongly linked to Alzheimer's disease. When sleep is disrupted for long periods of time, beta amyloid can begin accumulating in the brain. In other words, sleep is not simply rest. Sleep is maintenance. It is the brain's nightly repair cycle. Without it, the system slowly begins to break down. This discovery helped explain why long-term sleep deprivation can lead to severe cognitive problems. But it also revealed something even more alarming. Modern society may be creating the largest sleep deprivation experiment in human history. Over the past century, average sleep duration has steadily declined. Before electric lighting became widespread, most humans slept between 8 and 9 hours per night. Today, many adults average closer to 6 hours. Some sleep even less. Late-night screen exposure, work schedules, stress, and constant digital stimulation have pushed millions of people into chronic sleep deprivation. And the consequences are beginning to appear. Studies show that people who consistently sleep fewer than 6 hours per night face significantly higher risks of heart disease, stroke, obesity, depression, and weakened immune function. Even cognitive performance declines dramatically. After just 24 hours without sleep, a person's reaction time and decision-making ability can resemble someone with a blood alcohol level above the legal driving limit. In other words, severe sleep deprivation can make a completely sober person function like they are drunk. This is why fatigue-related accidents have become a major concern in many industries. Truck drivers, pilots, medical professionals, and military personnel often work long shifts that disrupt normal sleep patterns. And when sleep disappears, mistakes increase. But perhaps the most disturbing effect of sleep deprivation remains the same one scientists observed during Randy Gardner's experiment decades ago. The mind begins to fracture. When the brain is pushed too far without sleep, reality itself becomes unstable. Hallucinations appear. Paranoia develops. Memories blur. Eventually, the brain begins inserting fragments of dreams into waking life. It is as if the boundary between sleep and consciousness dissolves completely. This may explain why sleep deprivation has historically been used as a method of psychological torture. Without sleep, the human mind becomes vulnerable. After enough time, people begin losing their ability to think clearly, resist suggestion, or maintain emotional stability. But perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is that the brain always tries to protect itself. Even in the worst cases of sleep deprivation, the brain constantly searches for ways to recover. Microsleep episodes appear. Attention drifts. Consciousness fades in brief fragments. These are not failures. They are emergency survival mechanisms. The brain is trying to force rest. Because deep within the biology of every human being, sleep is written as a fundamental requirement. You cannot negotiate with it. You cannot replace it with caffeine, determination, or willpower. Eventually, the brain will take sleep whether you choose it or not. And if it cannot take sleep, the consequences can become catastrophic. So how long can the human mind survive without sleep? The most famous documented case remains Randy Gardner's 264 hours, just over 11 days. Beyond that point, the risks become unpredictable. Hallucinations intensify. Cognitive functions collapse. The mind struggles to maintain a stable perception of reality. And although the exact limit remains unknown, one thing has become clear through decades of research. Sleep is not a luxury. It is not wasted time. Sleep is one of the most important biological processes keeping the human brain alive. Every night, while we lie unconscious in darkness, the brain is performing one of the most complex maintenance operations in the human body. Repairing neurons, strengthening memories, regulating emotions, and cleaning the toxic byproducts of waking life. Without sleep, the mind slowly loses its ability to function, but with it, the brain resets itself again and again, night after night, keeping the fragile balance of human consciousness intact. And that raises one final question. If sleep is so essential, why do so many of us still treat it as something we can afford to lose? Perhaps the real mystery is not how long the human mind can survive without sleep. Perhaps the real mystery is why we ever try to live without it at all. If you found this story interesting, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And if you enjoyed this episode, leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching.